Hey guys, okay, I'm going to walk you through this Component 2 packet because it has a lot of valuable information from the Cambridge examiners, and I want you to see how it echoes all that we've worked toward in class, and I think helps give some good examples and just really narrows it down into well-formulated ideas. So this first piece is the I guess you could call it a rubric, but it shows the percentage in your final score that each component weighs. So your exam in May is the component 1, and it's 30% of your AS level score, which you can see here on the left side of the column. On the right side, it shows how the scores are sort of reweighed at the A level, because the A level includes this component 4 research report, and your AS level scores, as you know from your other Cambridge courses, are 50% of your A level score. So knowing that, it kind of gives you the reduced percentage at the A level, but let's focus on AS. So your exam in May is 30% of your score. This component 2 essay is 35% of your score, and the team project that we'll complete next is the remaining 35% of your score. These descriptions should be familiar to you, but you can reread them as you work through the packet yourself. This section is the mark scheme for paper 2, and you can sort of flip your paper. I wonder if I can flip it. Maybe not. You may just have to turn your head sideways. But each of these criterion is detailed below by an examiner. So it may be good for you to read this box and see what the highest level marks look like, how they define excellent communication skills, for example, or what they mean by analysis of sources being full and understanding of the argument. So reread through this box. I've gone through and highlighted the focal points of this document, and I'm also walking you through it, so as you're reading on your own, you can focus in on these highlights as well. These are the lower level bands of the mark scheme, so you'll see on this top page 29 to 35 marks, 22 through 28 marks, etc., with the corresponding level. It's always good to look at the highest level of the mark scheme so you know what you're reaching for, but it's also good to compare the language between all 5 just to see like what will raise your score in a sense. And the examiner comments below are good because they say specifically what will, for example, keep you at a level 3. It's 35 marks total, so you can be aware. Okay, so at the top, this is me just going over the high points, right? So you can read this entire document, you can watch this video, you can go through and reread the highlights, however you want to work through the document is fine, however much detail you need is fine. The top section here are the key messages from the examiners, and I just focus in on this point in that the evaluation of the sources and perspectives is the biggest part of this essay. So you're evaluating the source by including its validation and then also making comments about that. So if you have a source and you're validating it and you show, oh, it's from this publication or it lacks this global perspective, the way you validate the source in the paper gives you marks. And that's important because like I said in class the other day, you have to know, or your reader has to know where the source comes from to consider it trustworthy and to continue on in all of the ideas that you're shaping through the paper. Also, the evaluation of perspectives is important. So some ways of thinking, we know, are better than others, are more justified, more substantiated by evidence than others, and so it's good to point that out. It's not silly to spend time pointing out a flawed piece of reasoning in a certain perspective and then showing how that flawed piece of reasoning impacts the entire way of thinking. It makes it a poor way of thinking. So don't forget to evaluate at the small scale of a source and at the larger scale of the perspective. And other key messages here are important. I just really liked that one. So some general comments about the work seen by the examiners, as you can see here. The first part they talk about is length. and the advised minimum length is 1750 as far as word count. And they said essays were substantially shorter than that on some occasions, and that had a negative impact on student scores, and they will not grade beyond, they won't mark beyond 2,000 words. So know that. They said highly successful candidates had a good level of planning, and they, as it says, struck the necessary balance between the presentation of evidence, analysis, and evaluation in order to address all of the mark scheme, all the assessment criteria. They talk later in this document about how much evidence that you quote and being strategic about it. If you spend a ton of time doing these block quotations, that's reducing your word count and not really moving ideas forward. You want to comment on you want to include sources to show somebody else's way of thinking, but it's your way of thinking that's being judged. This is an idea that I hit home all the time, especially with my A-level this week. But depending on the way you structure your question, and I've told you guys this a couple times too, one will lead to analysis. One good way of structuring your question will lead to analysis, but a poor way of structuring your question will lead to only description. So when you think about how or what, sort of questions, there's only, you can answer a how question in one sentence. You can answer a what question sometimes in one sentence. So questions that already provoke debate, should, does, is, for example, we've worked on that already, already give you a higher degree of contrast in your paper, providing two sides. The next point I like in this, so one way to be successful in the paper, I suppose another way that's required, is to have globally contrasting perspectives. They talk about in this whole document not having enough, back to its previous point, analysis, but also not having analysis that's global in character. Some ways of thinking are really, limited geographically. Or even the issue is limited geographically. So establishing a strong question that is truly global in character, and I think most of us have already done that. These are problems, this smaller bulleted section, problems that they see with specific perspectives. You remember we talked about lenses. So if you put an issue at the center and you look at it from a technological lens, geographic lens, etc., the examiners say that sometimes students get confused with that, and they structure a paper around, in this example, violence in schools, how it's a social, economic, and technological issue. That thinking is meant to guide your research. It's not meant to structure your paper. So be wary of that. This is about the formatting of the question. Kind of back to what I just said. This is key, and I'm not afraid you guys will do this, but you really want to steer clear of adding the global perspectives as an afterthought. It needs to be central to your work. So it says here, sometimes candidates research firmly focused in the West and then show some awareness of that Western idea somewhere else. It's not meant to focus on where we are. You need to have a broader, and as you guys have seen in articles, global perspective. The rest of the document goes by criterion or by the mark. So this one's about communication skills. It talks about careful proofreading, setting up in your introduction the direction that you're going to take and how that's beneficial for your examiner. Doing citations well, so following Chicago style. They talk about right here how footnoted citations are highly effective, so that's why we use that citation style. This one is key, and this is something that I put in your research resources folder, but I haven't touched on recently. And you need some sources that are outside of the Western world. They give you a few here, like Al Jazeera, the Straits Times, China Daily. Now we know they're Anglophone, right? They're English speaking, which unless you are fluent in another language and literate in another language. This is our only option. But it's important to use some of those international sources. A lot of you have some on your board, I already know. But if you don't have international sources, that's something that you need to find before we start writing. So be aware. So you can only, I don't know if it says it in here. Yeah, limiting them to a level 3 for that entire mark. So without international sources, you'll be limited to a 3 on the second mark. So don't play yourself. The third mark is about analysis and evaluation. The first part that they mentioned that I like talks about use of sources, and you don't want to use too many, because then you kind of water down your focus a little bit. So it says that successful papers use a limited number of sources, with some others providing some background or corroboration, so putting two together to come up with a conclusion. And again, with the quotation, using brief but telling quotations from sources, followed by critical analysis. That analysis is key, and it's down to this second highlighted point here, that you assess the credibility of the source's claims, as well as just the source, and the implications for the conclusions in your entire question. So you're addressing the source's credibility in light of your question. It doesn't need to be some abstract, measure of credibility, but how effectively does it help you formulate your answer and evaluate the perspectives that you've established. This next little star that I have here is because I don't think I've introduced these terms to you, MEDCs and LEDCs. MEDC is a more economically developed country, and it's the way that we want to refer to a country's level of economic development. I hear every year the term third world countries, and that's not appropriate. You want to say more economically developed or less economically developed, because it's not a different world that those countries are living in. It's just a different level of development, and oftentimes due to other nations' impact. So we don't want to exclude any country. This is the appropriate way to refer. So make a note of that. It is good to choose vastly global issues, like climate change, and in this one, just issues of human rights that certain communities face. But you want to be careful in using really wide-reaching issues, because sometimes it doesn't create contrast. And that's in a structure of your question too. So, and specifically, criterion 4, as it shows, is about your empathy for alternative perspectives, which is an emotional response, right? Like, you have to emotionally engage with the material, but also just treat each perspective as valid and evidence-based, because if it wasn't, you shouldn't be writing about it. Some may be more well-reasoned, which is an empathetic way to deal with perspectives and not just remove them entirely and say, like, oh, this is poor, etc. Criterion 5, the quality of the perspectives developed. This, I think, is an interesting point. It says the best candidates demonstrated an awareness of how and why the perspectives differed, kind of talking about where they come from, those ways of thinking, which may be something that you hadn't thought of before. And I think that can lead to stronger marks when you're talking about global perspectives. Why do I see an issue differently than somebody that lives in Dubai, for example? Criterion 6 is your evaluation of perspectives. And this is a key point. Stronger candidates are able to analyze and evaluate the strength of the argument in terms of their contribution to the perspective. So it's not just that you're evaluating arguments, but how that bears on the entire way of thinking, the yes or no side in its entirety. So yeah, benefits from analyzing and explaining the arguments, but essentially that they understand they're just building blocks. Okay, I'm going to pause this video and start another one because I'm at 14 minutes.